Good afternoon, and many thanks to the organizers for the very kind invitation, and it's an honor and a pleasure to be here. I'm very pleased to be back in Tehran, and thank you very much for all for coming to this session. The word presence that I'm going to use has a particular meaning in Persian, huzur, which has many layers of meaning, and I'm not going to be able to deliver those layers. But I've tried to give a little bit of, let me see. Right. I'm going to organize it in this way, to talk about the space of possible presence, the space of symbolic, and the space of active presence. I need to see how I can change this, and I see it myself. Okay. Now, I start with the space of possible presence, and I explain these as I go along. Right, I start by the idea of space of possible, public space as the space of possible presence, meaning the possibility of being present in a space. Now, I start by a few definitions, and I quickly move into those details. Public space is defined in some ways as a negative concept. It is what is not private, beyond private territories. But also it has an affirmative, positive meaning. That means the space that people share. It's an inclusive social space that people can be together and interact. Now, it's a very broad concept, and maybe we could look at it into these two interrelated spheres. There's one sphere of mediated presence and interaction, which is through institutions and technologies, and there is also the space of direct presence. Can that light be turned off, please? Which is the physical space of people being together, being in that place, and that's where people are bodily present and face-to-face encounters are made possible. And that is what I am focusing on in this talk, although I touch on that mediated and institutional concept of publicness as well. So when you look at the public space in the physical sense, you see it's again defined by the absence of fixed structures, buildings, private territories. It's a place of interaction between the public and the private. They are together always make sense. They are not concepts in a vacuum. And it's part of the urban texture, is a shared space of different possibilities. Public space offers different possibilities for many people to do different things. And that's one of these key characteristics. And it's an environment that has many different functions and meanings. So it's not reducible to ideas and single functions. It is as a shared space. Look at these cities from 3,800 BC, city of Ur in Mesopotamia, and the city of Çatalhöyük in what is now Turkey, from 7,000 years BC. When you look at them, you see shared spaces, the spaces of movement and the spaces of repose, as Dr. Pujafar was talking yesterday about. So it's not a new concept, the shared space. But what makes a place public in our current state of thinking? If you ask these three questions, interest, agency, and access, whose interest is it serving? Who benefits from it? Is it somebody, everybody uses and serves everybody in a wide sense? or is it limited to a number of people? Agency, who is in charge of controlling and managing it? And access. Access is the key concept. Accessibility is the more accessible a place is, the more public it is. That is the key concept around which you can determine whether somewhere is public or not. But public is not a single thing, it's a range of conditions. So we have range of publicness. But you see the inclusivity, inclusive presence has to be judged on the basis of accessibility primarily, but also the issues of agency and interest come into it. Also, public space is not a static object there. It is part of a process of making cities. It's an integral part of urban development and change. If you look at how the cities are made, you can look at how there are people who build the city, producers of the city, there are people who regulate, usually public authorities who regulate and manage the city, and there are users, if you call them, people who live in the city, us who live in the city, and not only in time now, but in the future as well. So it is these different stakeholders, and they have different values. Some people come and look at the space with only exchange value. How can I sell? How much can I sell it in the market? Some people think of it as the use of it, and some people have a symbolic meaning for it. And what we have is overlapping, ambiguous, and conflicting views, roles, and values. In each situation, you have people from different perspectives with different sets of values. They have different expectations. And that's what complicates the situation. It's never very clear-cut. Usually it's not very clear-cut. And ultimately, for example, when you say somebody who makes the city, but the city is not only made by people who physically build it. City is made also by people who decide to pass through this space or not. You are making that city. If you are deciding to be in a place or not, you are a maker of that city. Let's look at some of these different stakeholders and what they think about and what they do. This is a picture from South London in Croydon, and a developer who talks about this square, Ruskin Square, as a catalyst for development. It is a part of giving real estate value, property value, to the urban development project. And many people that I've seen talk about they evaluate public spaces by the effect they have on the property value of the surrounding areas. Now, that is a reductive set of criteria for evaluation, but that's the exchange value that they think about. If you look at the architects and planners, I've got these two quotes from these two famous architects, Norman Foster and Richard Rogers. Norman Foster talks about public space as the urban glue. Richard Rogers talks about, and that's the direct quote from him, architecture is about public space held by buildings. So these are very building-oriented architects, as you probably know their buildings, and they still talk about public space as such a central concept in urban development. And the RIBA, the Institute of British Architects, gave their prize in 2017 to this pier, which is a public space in the city of Hastings. Civil society groups, there are many of them campaigning for public space. You see guerrilla gardening, people who just want to plant trees where there are abandoned places, or organizations like Design Trust and European Pride, or Project for Public Spaces. These are in New York, that's in Barcelona. People who campaign, they're not government, they're not developers. They're campaigning, they're trying to promote and improve the quality of public spaces. And there are governments as well. Public authorities are now promoting the development. That's on the left. On the left is the policy framework for the local authorities to how to develop their public spaces. And there is a manifesto for London, as you see up there, and UN Habitat. Today there was a meeting in Stockholm about public space that UN Habitat wanted to promote. I couldn't, unfortunately, be there, but you see that public authorities, international organizations, is such a thing that is being promoted by many people. But we have to keep a critical eye all the time. When they say public, what do we mean in a pluralist society? Every society is pluralist by definition, some more than the others. And it has often promoting a vision of unity and homogeneity in the public, whereas in reality they are gender differentiated and stratified. And these are the conditions in which now we want to pack everything into a single concept of the public. And at that we have to be a bit careful about what we mean by the public. Is there such a thing? Now, there are several challenges to public spaces. And one is the challenge of technology. This is from Le Corbusier's idea of the city of future. This is partially implemented in Paris, if you like. If you go top of the Champs-Élysées, you can see a bit of it. But really, this is the way that cities were imagined. And the city, Fritz Lang's Metropolis, the famous film, and also, this is Tokyo, this is reality, that cities have been built on this basis of a technological idea of what a city is. And this sort of environment, there's no thought of the face of open space of face-to-face encounters. Everything is driven by the technology of mobility. But we have this change of perspective. Yesterday we heard about the transport mentality that has changed, and the car is now not loved as much as it used to be. So what we see is also a change in the concept of urban space, that from a technological, we see a humanistic approach. And from a bird's eye view of seeing everything from the top, of an expert trying to deal with the reality, we are talking about a human eye level, street eye level view, that we imagine ourselves to be in it rather than treating it from the top, from above. At some point the city was a machine, a building was a machine, but now is a place. So you see that transition of scale from huge scales. Now, this is in rhetoric, and whether in practice is another story, because the gigantic scales and the machine ideas continue. If you look at the urbanization in China, you can see that this continues at such scale that probably unprecedented in human history. But nevertheless, even in China, there is this movement. Even in America, there's this movement from car-based suburbs to walkable neighborhoods, and from cars to public transport and bicycles and pedestrians, and from cyber exchange, that at some point people thought that the cities would disappear, to personal encounters. So these are the changes, and that's the Copenhagen that everybody uses as a good example of urbanity and making places human scale. These are some examples of this change. In Seoul, this was a high-level road, and they changed it to this. It used to be a stream. They covered it to make it a highway. They removed the highway. They reintroduced the stream, although the stream may be a little bit manufactured now. Somebody said that they just bring water from the river and inject into this. But nevertheless, it's a change of mentality. The way that that is imagined now, the imagination has changed. The same in Paris. This is the Pompidou Express going along the Seine, and now is turned into this. First it was the gimmicky Paris plage, the summer plages, but now is much more established as a pedestrian space along the river. Again, a mentality has changed. But the challenge of mobility, this is a railway station in London, the challenge of mobility and spatial dispersion remains. That means that suburbanization, and that is counter to the idea of public space, because in many suburban spaces, a public space does not exist as such, because a suburban space is a private space, a private. The concept of a suburban sprawl is not to be together, it's to be away from each other, to have our individual spaces. But now even, as I said, even in America, this is in Nashville, the idea of walkable neighborhoods is really everyday occurrence, in developers even are promoting and advocating and developing walkable neighborhoods. Basically, still, is very highly car dependent, but at least within a certain area, you can walk. But also the space in cities that have continued with having these spaces like this Venice, that these little neighborhoods have their own spaces and they are the spaces of the local community, and they continue to function in that sense to some extent. But now the challenge of digital technology is a new challenge. That this is from building somewhere that I took this off the internet, but you can see this in many neighborhoods, particularly international neighborhoods in Europe, where people come from all over the world and they use these satellite dishes to watch television in their own language, and that creates that you are globally connected but locally disconnected. And local disconnection makes it difficult to develop vibrant public spaces. Now, there is this archetype of agora in Athens. This is the current condition of agora. And everybody talks about agora as the archetypal of public space. Everybody says, everybody measures everything against that. And of course it was a limited space in many ways. But nevertheless, it had a combination of commerce, politics, culture. It was a core. But now we have communication in mediated ways, from Gutenberg's printing to nowadays to institutions of democracy, and then to technologies of digital communication. The whole idea of communication has changed in many ways. But people thought that this would take the need for city. Even I've read texts from 40, 50 years ago that people thought, now that we can travel everywhere and we have telephone, we don't need cities anymore. And now, even with this digital technology, what we see is that cities are growing, particularly big cities. And if you look at data in Europe, bigger cities are growing much faster than others. But also, inequality is growing. And these are from different documents by European Union, OECD, UK government, that talk about how in the last 30 years, inequality, social inequality has grown. And different groups have widened. The gap between different groups has widened. And this is from Dublin, where a wall is built between the have and have-nots, between on the left-hand side a new project of regeneration, and on the right side a poorer neighborhood. And I don't know, maybe I have talked about this before, but the kids on this side were throwing stone into the regenerated neighborhood of the gentrification neighborhood, and they put this mesh on top of the wall, and the kids call this Berlin Wall. And also, this is a project in Milan, designed by Zaha Hadid, and beautiful housing project at the back. But what I want you to look at is the boundary between the public and the private. It's like a fortress. It's designed to be a fortress and giving that impression. Now, look at the other side of the street, just across the street, and it's a banal architecture. It's not designed by Zaha Hadid or anybody probably famous, but it's very much more welcoming. It's a fence. It's still not bringing you to their homes, but it is much more civilized encounter between the two spheres of the public and the private. And if you go back a generation in Milan, that's what you see. Much more generous public spaces without any barriers. You could just walk in. Another challenge in these cities is diversification, the social diversification, ethnic diversification. This is in Paris, in Barbès area. It's a market under the metro lines. And it's North Africans usually trading there. It's very popular, as you see. All people, not only North Africans, everybody comes here to do shopping. But the municipality people are not happy with this. They think that they pray in the street and they are disruptive to what counts as Parisian life. So diversity is a challenge to people who live in those areas, and it's a very big challenge in Europe now because of the big waves of migration and refugees. And of course, the ultimate challenge is homelessness. This is again in Paris that you see in the public space. Many cities now, the public space is the last refuge of homeless people. That's where they don't have anywhere else to go. British cities now have multiplied the number of homeless people living on the streets because of the austerity, because of the problems of economic decline. And the public space is the theater of social fractures, therefore. The youth behavior in public spaces, the vandalism that sometimes is seen. But if you remember the work of William White, the American sociologist who studied New York spaces, and one of his key conclusions was that seating is very important for the vitality of the public space, to make it interesting to people. If you can sit somewhere, you make that place much more interesting. And you see, it is in front of the public library in New York, but now, and this is in Stockholm, very generously provided, but now some cities are building benches that nobody can sit on or lean on. It's just either tilted or with spikes or something that you cannot really sit. Or they take away the seating, basically. And there's a politics of seating in many cities, and where the homeless can sit, the elderly need to sit when they walk a bit, but many things are now. I saw this presentation this morning from Prague that when you want to sit, obviously you have to pay, and many places. And now airports, you have to wait for your flight, but there's nowhere to sit without paying. There are very few seats. The rest is paying seats. Railway stations, they are becoming shopping malls. These are all in Europe. So everything is driven by a commercial. And that means that the possibility of presence, if you don't have the money, if you're not well off, if you're not in a good condition, becomes less and less. Especially, for example, there's a huge problem with the elderly ability to be if the spaces, if you look at the spaces of Tehran, if you are an elderly person, if you have to be on wheelchair, if you have to push your child's chair, is not easy to. You have to have good surfaces for people to be able to navigate. And the question of free access to green open space is now a challenging issue. First time I heard that in Egypt you have to pay to get into a public park, I was amazed. That was the first time I heard that. And this is becoming a reality when the public authorities don't have money to look after the parks. Now, the second item is the space of symbolic presence. And so all of these challenges that I mentioned were challenges that prevent the possibility of people of different conditions, different backgrounds, being present in a place. Not doing anything particular, although that being is a positive making of the place, but in a way still is relatively passive. The symbolic public space is a symbolic place, is a place of display, performance, is a performative space. And that's why it's always been used by the authorities to stamp their power and to show the public space is the place of the display of power, as in this case of The Hague. But now, this is from Vienna, and then the professor from Vienna yesterday was here. The city of Vienna changed its conditions in the late 19th century to become much more democratized. And nowadays, obviously, the symbols that you see in public areas, beyond the symbols of money and commerce and in particular interests, public art is on display rather than a particular person or a particular powerful organization. So it becomes much more welcoming or much more democratic in that sense. The symbolics of public space moves from the space of power to the state of people, at least in rhetoric. or it becomes the space of commerce. As I said, this is in Paris, and then obviously the city is taken over by this brand. It's temporary, but still. The case we heard about, the case in Copenhagen. This is a neighborhood in Copenhagen, a multi-ethnic neighborhood, and the symbolic element of this public space is that they've brought in symbolic elements of different ethnicities and nationalities that are present in that place. So this is from Salvador Allende of Chile, and that's from Russians, and that's for Chinese. Different elements. This is a kind of symbolic presence, recognizing different groups and ethnicities and minorities, at least to give them a stake in symbolic terms. And the final category is the active presence, where you can do things in the public space. You can do things, this is a museum, you can do things for learning, you can get out into public institutions and public spaces, possibility of learning, you can do sport. These are the possibilities of active engagement. But the challenge, as I said, this is from the UK, that the spending on parks is going down, and it's a really big problem. And now they are transferring the control of some parks into charities, NGOs, and that's a big issue. But also the space of exchange. This is from Athens, and there's been always street markets, public spaces as a place of exchange has always been the case in this sort of scale. But now we are talking about different scale of commercial interest and activity. This is the city centre of Nottingham in the UK, in England. And that's a quote from a planner, from the public authority of the city. And he said to somebody who was doing a PhD research that this space is the main space of the city, is a private property. We rent it on a rental basis. So they see it as, obviously, this is not the official view of the local authority, but that shows the mentality that has changed, that you see the place as the place of everyone, or the place in an instrumental way, that you can, what can you make out of it? How can you make it into an asset, into a commodity? And the big example of that is in Liverpool, in England again. This is 42.5 acre site. Acre is 4,000 square meters. That a company has bought, has taken over for 250 years. And they've privatized 35 streets of the city center. And they've changed the city center. Now, this is a city suffering from a lot of problems over the years. It was at one point a very successful city. But now it's been a city of, for some time, declining city. So it wants investment, and because of that, it welcomes investment. And any investment is welcome in the conditions of economic problems, and that's why what you get is willingness to give away the publicness of the city, and lots of architectural prizes have been won by this. And that's a warning by the London Assembly that public life is now increasingly in private hands because of that situation. And this is a photo I took. There was a Biennale of public space in Rome, and I took this. Somebody had put this on the wall. I took this, and they say private space is this big, and public space is so small. And why? Now, people use public space as a catalyst for regeneration, as in this case is in Glasgow, as you see, and also post-industrial. Regeneration is everywhere. This is in Beijing, is an area that is industrial decline. They use the public institutions, the public environment as a catalyst for regeneration of the place. But also the problem is that regeneration might be gentrificated, might And that is the question about Brixton. Brixton in South London is a place of a concentration of Afro-Caribbeans, and now is taken over, the market is taken over by some young entrepreneurs. And it obviously improves the quality, but it pushes out because it pushes out the local blacks. And this is from Nicosia in Cyprus, where they use this for global marketing and branding. As you don't see the details of that image on the wall, that is a space to be designed by, it has been designed by Zaha Hadid, it's going to be built, it's been on the making for many years. But also the public environments, public infrastructure, public spaces can be a catalyst for social integration, social improvement. And this is the case in the city of Medellin in Colombia, that they put this system of transport to give access to people who live in these slums on the hills, so that they can come. It's an integrated system of transport. They come and they can go anywhere in the city very cheaply, and they are able to get to their workplace without much problem. And it's a space where people can get together. It is in Brussels. People got together. They created a park, a temporary park, and the city council had to recognize that the temporary park was okay. It didn't kill the city. It was okay. It's not a permanent park. So it was a space of collective action. This is the back streets that people get together and create a closed environment. It is closing the public environment, but it's a place of litter and danger, and people, the local community, get together and create a space, a collective space, a communal space. And you can think of public space as also a place of free expression or a place of debate. I'm going a bit faster because I've got to finish. But the case is the communicative and the political aspect of the space becomes significant. And this is in Madrid. That what we saw, the public space, was the space of the state, and the power, in a sense, the power is transferred to the people in some ways, in some places, to some extent, in a limited way. But what you see is that the space is affording that has the capacity, and allowing participatory governance in some projects, like this one in Birmingham. So this is my last slide. That public space is not separate from society, is a mirror of the urban society. If you go to a city, you look at their public environments, and you can make a reading of that environment, of that society. As much as they pay attention to their public environment, it gives you an understanding of the character of that society. It's very important, therefore, if the society wants to improve, to develop and enrich that. It's the window, if you like, the display window of a city. But it shouldn't be just a display window. It should be sufficiently integrated into society that it's a real expression of a society rather than just an appearance. But we know that it's not easy, and roles and functions and values are always overlapping or colliding. And in all these discussions that I made and anybody else makes about public space, the significant thing is to keep a critical eye, keep a critical perspective. Don't take things for granted. Because when something becomes so commonly held, everybody says such a good thing. You always have to look behind to see in what context, for what purpose, what are they talking about. Because goodness to one person may not be necessarily goodness to another. So not to say that there are no conditions that everybody can enjoy and benefit, but you've got to keep a critical perspective all the time. Thank you very much. Now, I've been given a piece of paper that says, please encourage people to have questions for 5 minutes. I'm happy to answer if I can.
Thank you so much for your presentation. In your presentation, you mentioned changing mindset. It's one of the main reasons behind this shift from, for example, car-based to pedestrian-based. Or the last one you mentioned, public space is a mirror of urban society. If we look at our pedagogy in the universities and our way of teaching in the universities, we usually focus on design and we are less focusing on these kind of things. My question is that to some extent, do you think we need to change our way of teaching to be more responsible about public awareness and also to, raising these, kind of issues and have more care about these changes?
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Well, design, you've got to see what design is. Design is giving form and shape to an idea, or exploring and bringing out an idea. So design is not just some lines, it is a process of delivery. If you think about art and design, art may be just explorations without any particular purpose, but design is usually a purposeful process of doing something for a particular purpose. Design is not like painting. The painting does not need to be purposeful. It's just an exploration or expression. But design is purposeful. And if you design a kettle that doesn't work, it's not, you haven't been successful. And when you're talking about urban environments, we are talking about provide a purposeful process of providing spaces for people who use it or live in it or future generations or whatever. So if we think that way, then design, the process of design as a skill is at the service of that. If we don't think about those purposes, then we are just a mere technician. But if we think about that process in its totality, then we are a thoughtful designer. And that would be a good thing to do in the academic environment. And of course, for the students, they don't need to be constantly very practical. They can be imaginative and all that, and they can be imagining possible futures that may or may not exist. And that's a good thing about the educational possibilities. But they don't have to think about consultants to deliver a particular purpose. But nevertheless, there is a social purpose underlying all design work.
Yeah, but also we don't have this responsibility about raising the barriers. I mean,
Yeah.
do you think we need, or do you have any suggestion about, the way of our?
Yeah. Well, it's. I mean, I think even if when you think that you are not thinking about design, social issues, you are. There are hidden underlying assumptions that we all make in what we do, and they are there. We need just to become aware of it ourselves.
Professor, yeah. Fábio Lima from Brazil. Please, Professor, I think that we have the solutions to the problems in the academic places. Okay, universities, we have wonderful laws, wonderful plans, and the difficult to me is think about the participatory process and how we in the university, how we can leave these ideas to the communities, to the people that use the public space. You understand? And I ask you to say some words and also how we can change the politics in the management of the city to use our knowledge of as urban planners, to use our knowledge as urban designers, and to really change the situation of traffic, of problems, a lot of problems we have in our cities. In Tehran and also in Brazil, we have similarities in the problem of the public spaces.
Yeah.
Okay?
Yeah, thank you. There was a brilliant Colombian PhD student in our university, and he was talking about, he did his PhD, I was the examiner of the PhD, I wasn't the supervisor. But his study was a series of case studies in Bogota, where the areas, the so-called shanty towns, were upgraded by the people who lived in them, but with the support of the designers and the support of the municipality. So the people had passed that first level of building a home for themselves, and now they were in a situation of thinking about, okay, we need a playground, we need a football space, we need a bit of a park. And so the title of his PhD was El Parco de Mio. So the idea of how these people, because these areas have been condemned as shantytowns, slums that have to be demolished and cleared away, whereas people had built themselves these homes but with their hands, and they, if you think about them as baby towns that are growing and becoming mature towns, they are the nucleus of a city emerging. And if the municipality is sufficiently wide, keeping its mind open and helping people, that's what happened in Bogota, that the municipality provides architectural services and some building materials and things. People do it themselves, but so it's possible for people with very little money to improve. And if we are sufficiently open-minded, we can help them. And if we think big projects, and that the schools of architecture usually teaches students to think Le Corbusier and think Zaha Hadid, that becomes very difficult then for themselves to bring their ego down to the level of thinking for small-scale changes and working with communities. So it's a very big challenge, but there is also possibilities. There's a way for positive outcomes.
Thank you.
I think this would be the last because the 5 minutes would be up.
Thank you for your honor.
Sorry. Oh, sorry. There are two then. Okay. I'll come back to you. Please.
My question was that the issues we talked about here, are they worldwide? Are they the issues we have now in Iran, for example, or the issues people have in India, or I don't know, anywhere in Asia? Are they just about Europe and the United States? Or the examples you brought, they're just cities around Europe, I think. You didn't say anything about South Asia or Africa. That's my question, where poverty is the first issue. Are we facing this kind of problems? Or are we just looking to the world as the West and the United States?
Okay, thank you. Yes, of course, these are all from Europe, and I particularly want to only talk about Europe because I don't think that I know enough about Iran to talk about Iran. I know a bit, but if I say anything, it would be wrong of me as someone who sits outside and says things, pontificates about things here. So I don't talk about Iran. I talk about Europe But some of those issues are wide-ranging and apply everywhere. In a sense, the question of accessibility is a global thing. The question of then the ways of access, the ways access is facilitated or blocked, varies place to place. The question of the agency in charge, the diversity of stakeholders, the question of the range of views and values. These are you can find in all places. I've worked with students and examples. I could have done livelihood operators in Africa or slum upgrading in Latin America, all of these things. I've worked with people on these subjects, but my focus today was only on Europe, on the public space in the context of the European discourse, and even not much American discourse, mostly European discourse. And I hope you forgive me for doing that, but I'm aware that if I want to cross these into different places, it may be muddling the situation. And I'm not talking about using these to apply them to Iran or elsewhere. But there are there is similarities and there are differences. Sometimes people talk about how different it is, a city in Europe from a city in Iran or a city in Africa. But you can see many similarities as well. There are not only differences. I did a book that you may have seen, Whose Public Space, and we had case studies from around the world, and you can see similarities, the challenges that face people in various places. So it's not. There are real differences and there are real similarities. The last one.
Thank you for your presentation. You have talked about the critical point of view and perspective. I want to ask you how urban designer could do this point of view. How urban designer could be a more critical and there is a risk that urban designers are going to do what power and what decision makers want them. How urban designer could do some things for social, I want to ask you how we could be more social active than just a professional and specialist.
Yeah. There are people in this audience who've tried that for many years, and of course the question is, there is no particular. We cannot say a particular form is belongs to a particular ideology or a particular class. So the question is, how do you employ form? How do you shape things? How do you organize things? And if the people who are in charge, the kind of technical people, if you like, or creative people or artists or whoever is in charge of that job of shaping, if they have the mentality of not saying, I am employed by this powerful and rich person, I have to deliver what they want. If you do that, then you are just a robot. If you are, but no one is a robot. They do make choices, and then you can make different choices. You are not obliged. Sometimes you can shift things in subtle ways. You can, if you have that mentality of a more, if you like, society-minded mentality or a money-minded mentality. So it's down to individuals as well. Okay, thank you very much.